Let's zoom out once again. There's a difference between cause, as you've talked about, cause and motivation.
Absolutely.
Quite a large number of people volunteered to fight.
In fact, a majority of all the soldiers who fought on both sides were volunteers during the Civil War. About 3 million served, 2.2 million in the United States, 800, 900,000 in the Confederacy. It's, again, I talk about things that are hard to get students to understand. This is one of them. They have to separate. The causation and motivation are often conflated, and not just by students, but also by lots of talking heads on newscasts in the United States who don't know anything about United States history, but know what they know. In terms of causation, if you take slavery out of the picture, there is no Civil War, period.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a long conversation you need. You ask the question, that's the answer. Let's go to the next question.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is, okay, so were most white people motivated to put on blue uniforms because they wanted to kill slavery? The answer to that is no, they were not. They were motivated to put on blue uniforms to salvage the Union, which they saw as a unique gift that the founding generation, based on the bloodshed in the American Revolution, had bequeathed to successive generations. And the two key parts of what the Union meant for them was, number one, you had a voice in your own government. And someone will always say now to me, well, but women couldn't vote. That's right. The people who could vote by our standards were limited in the 19th century, but within the context of the Western world in 1860, the United States had by far the broadest franchise, by far. And so they argued that's one thing the Union gives us, and it also gives us the chance to rise economically. It doesn't guarantee that you can succeed, but it means you're not doomed to be what your father was.
Mm-hmm.
And those are worth fighting for. And so I will put on a uniform so the slave-holding aristocrats and oligarchs, which is what they called them, of the South, they said they don't really believe in democracy. It's an oligarchy in the South. It's a slavery-based oligarchy. And we know which way Europe's going, they said. The revolutions of the 1840s failed in Europe. Europe's going the wrong way. They're going toward more aristocracy, more oligarchy, more. And we are the last hope. When Lincoln spoke of the last best hope of earth, which he did in one of his most memorable phrases, he's meaning that the United States is a beacon of small d democracy in a Western world that seems to be turning the other way. And those soldiers, it was that important to them. They are citizens in a republic that people shed blood to establish, and we can't let it go. Part of the compact is I'm a citizen. I derive these benefits from this republic, from the Union. I can have a voice in government. I can rise economically or have the chance to. I owe my service to that republic. That's what most of them would have said if you'd pressed them on why they're doing it. It doesn't mean everybody was on fire with ideology that way. Some guys would say, well, you know what? I'm broke and I'm going to get fed and clothed in the Army. But this sense of exceptionalism's unpopular now in the United States, but Americans had a sense of themselves as a truly exceptionalist society within the context of the Western world.
And as a small aside, terminology-wise, blue is the Union, or what we think of as the United States, and red is the Confederacy.
Yes, on the maps, the Confederate units are red blocks, and the United States units are blue blocks. That's right.
And
that is correct.
And the North and the South is another way we'll refer to it, just to clarify.
And let me have a very brief rant on North and South.
Yeah.
I prefer to see this as a war between two mid-19th century republics, one of which didn't last very long and spent its whole life in the midst of a great war. There were 15 slaveholding states in 1860. Only 11 of them seceded from the United States.
Even though there's 13 stars, we'll talk about that.
We'll talk about that demented notion of things in just a minute. But there are only 11 leave. So there are 4 slaveholding states in the United States. Kentucky and Missouri and Maryland and Delaware remain in the United States. So it's not just North versus South. Those states are all part of the South. It's the United States versus the Confederacy.
But see how you refer to it as the United States. So the Union is also referred to as the United States.
That's correct. Yes. Yes.
But the Confederacy was, as you write about, a set of people who also had a sense of nationalism, pride,
Well, and took their founding document. I mean, it took the whole summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, that hot, steamy, humid summer of 1787, to come up with the Constitution. The Confederates did it quickly because they basically had the U.S. Constitution here, a blank piece of paper over here,
Mm.
copied most of the Constitution over here, just changed the parts that they needed to make sure slavery was protected and you didn't have the wrong kind of tariffs and so forth. That's one reason they could do it so quickly. It's absolutely based on the government they've been thriving under, which is under the United States Constitution. Both sides claimed they were the true inheritors of the revolutionary generation. That was one of their, they all, Jefferson Davis loved the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration is Abraham Lincoln's favorite document. They just liked different parts of it.
So we should think of this as two republics.
I argue that makes many people very angry.
I will make many people angry today.
They say that I am conferring legitimacy on the Confederacy that they don't deserve. And my response to that is they have a national government, they have a Senate, they have a Congress, they have an army, they have a navy, they have departments. It walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. In the end, it's a slaughtered duck faster than it would have been because the United States military forces crushed it.
We should say that you are respected, admired, loved by most people on both sides. From a perspective sense, you're deeply respected by historians of Civil War and just historians of American history. But of course, when you do your job well on a controversial topic in a controversial period of human history, you're going to get hopefully an equal amount of critics on both sides. And that's when you do your job well. So sometimes when we speak today, some of the controversial, quote unquote, controversial things that you express are controversial from that small minority of folks on both sides for different reasons.
Yes, I won't. One of my favorite pieces of hate mail I got was an email where this guy, he was upset that I referred to the Confederacy as a slaveholding republic and he said that he hoped I would develop virulent pancreatic cancer and die a horrible death, not just regular pancreatic cancer. He wanted virulent pancreatic cancer. And then he signed his name and said he'd be happy to talk to me anytime I wanted to.
Yeah. I'm sure that would be a wonderful conversation.
Yeah.
But there's also really strong senses throughout the United States of this diversity of opinion of what is the United States.
Of course.
And
yes.
that's where the passion is really rooted.
Both sides claimed in the election of 1860, Douglas talked about how much he loved the Union. Lincoln talked about how much he loved the Union. Breckinridge talked about how much he loved the Union. And John Bell, who's the Unionist, the Constitutional Union, that's all he talked about. They just had different versions of what the Union was.
And that's why I love this country. I think it's the greatest country on earth, and it has a bunch of people that very strongly disagree with each other. Of course, hopefully never again escalating to the degree that it did during this period of time. So we talked about the blue people on the map and the red people on the map. It may be a silly thing to ask, but sticking with the motivation, why would, let's say, a farm boy in Ohio want to die for the Union?
That is the most important, and I didn't even ask you to ask that question. That's the hardest thing.
Let's be honest, you paid me a lot of money to ask that question, yeah.
I didn't think it was so much.
Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I won't distract.
I tell my students at the beginning of my Civil War class that if they couldn't explain, I didn't use Ohio. I said, if you can't explain why a farmer from Vermont would put on a blue uniform and pick up a musket to make South Carolina come back in, why didn't he just say, great, South Carolina's gone. I never liked them anyway. This is a better union. If you can't explain that, then you can't understand the Civil War. And the key to that, I'll come back to it, is union, because he would have said, if we allow South Carolina to go, that means that other places could go and you could dismantle. And the only reason they're going is because they didn't like who was elected president. They didn't say that Lincoln was corrupt. They didn't say Republicans bought the election. They just didn't like who won the election. And so if the republic is so fragile that it can't have an election without having the people who didn't like who won leave, then the founders had wasted their time. The revolution was for nothing. All that bloodshed meant nothing. You had to step up and save this precious republic that had put in place by the revolutionary generation and gave its citizens the benefits that I've already talked about. That's why they would put on a uniform and risk their life, because they believed a citizen, these are citizen soldiers. We don't know what that means so much now because we have a professional military establishment now. Even when I was younger, there was still a draft, but that's gone now. And so we don't understand what the concept of citizen soldier was, that you owe something back to the republic that has conveyed these things to you. And that's why the guy from Vermont or New Hampshire or Ohio would put on a uniform and go into military service.
Is it possible for us to understand that level of love of nation and believe in nation? Is this very distant from what America is today?
I actually think many people probably still feel that way, but they're not the ones who are on television
Yeah.
most of the time. Republicans in the midst of the war commented about the fact that even with this gigantic conflict going on, immigration continued at a high level. People coming into a nation that was in the middle of a great war. And they said this is a testament to the promise of the United States. And I think that that promise continues. I mean, we've argued about, as with so many things, Americans have no sense of history. They believe we've never argued about immigration before. We've always argued about immigration, with some people always saying, shut the door, they're ruining us. The Italians are ruining us. The Irish are Catholics, they're ruining us. God, the Southern Europeans are even worse than the Irish were. It's the people change, the arguments stay very much the same. And I think it's really telling that in the midst of the war, people would say, look at our republic. It offers so much to people that even in the midst of this great war, they're still coming to the United States.
And like you said, both sides, both these republics claimed, for example, George Washington.
Yes, they both claim. I'll leave it at that. They both claim George Washington. They wanted to be right with the man, which is what George Washington was. He's the indispensable man, no question. Both sides wanted him on their side. They both quoted Thomas Jefferson, although Confederates were a little more leery of Jefferson because he's too complicated for them sometimes. But no, they wanted to be right with the founders and claimed to be right with the founders. The Confederates would say, the Constitution allowed slavery. What are you talking about? We're out of step with the Constitution. We're in step with the You're the ones who are out of step with the Constitution.
What about the topic of states' rights? At the very least,
I love state rights. State rights. I mean, I love the way people use it with the Civil War. They associate it solely with Southern states, of course. State rights is always available in United States history for somebody who's not happy with what the federal government is doing. During the War of 1812, it was New England that most often talked about resorting to state rights. They had a convention where they sort of wandered over towards secession territory in the Hartford Convention. We think of it as state rights because as you lead up to the Civil War, you hear white Southerners talking about it all the time. We need our state rights. I always love to ask people who say that, what are all the state rights? List the state rights that the white South is concerned. Give me the top three. No, really, just give me the top two. There's only one. The state right that they're worried about is the right of their state to interpose its power between a federal government that might try to interfere with slavery and a state government that wants to maintain it. That's the state right that matters then. Northern states also resorted to state rights during the ramp up to the Civil War with what were called personal liberty laws. They tried to interpose their state power in between a federal government that would use its power to force enslaved people back into slavery. It's whoever's unhappy with the federal government, the concept of state rights is available, and both sides used it.
And of course, the beautiful, dark, ironic hypocrisy was illustrated by the Confederacy when they were the first to pass a national draft in American history.
Lex, irony is wonderful in history. Another thing that I love to teach is that the most intrusive central government in American history, by far, until deep into the 20th century, was the Confederate central government, because it had to do things to keep the war going that it couldn't have done unless the central government stepped in, such as passing the first national conscription law in American history. The U.S. government never forced people into uniform before the Civil War. The Confederates did it first. They did it in the spring of 1862. They passed a national graduated income tax. And when taxing didn't work, when their money became so devalued, they then passed what they called the tax in kind. They would take a percentage of your crop. They allowed the government to impress horses and mules and enslaved labor to work on. All of these were intrusions from the central government that drove true state rights people crazy in the Confederacy. Confederates didn't have political parties because they said the founders didn't want them, so we won't have them. But what they did have was a sort of nationalist, we're going to let the central government do whatever it needs to do. That's Jefferson Davis's wing, and Robert E. Lee's over there too. And the people like the vice president, Alexander Stephens, who said, you can't do all this stuff because the states should have more power. The only reason the war lasted as long as it did is because the central government did things no one ever would have believed they would do. He also got rid of habeas corpus, just like Abraham Lincoln did in selected situations.
And of course, we should really emphasize that on both sides, those volunteers, on the Confederacy, there's a very large number of people, percentage-wise, that volunteered to fight. And then I believe the volunteer period was 1 year. And then there's all kind of funky stuff that the government started doing to trap those people into then serving.
Here's what the Confederacy did.
Yeah.
Nobody thinks the war is going to last a long time
Right.
in the spring of 1861. So if you enlist for a year, that's probably plenty of time to finish this war. Well, a year goes by and a significant percentage of the Confederate men under arms are due to get out. So what the Confederate Congress did was pass conscription. We're going to make everybody liable to 3 years service. And in the midst of doing that, all you guys who volunteered for 1 year are now in for 2 more years.
Yeah.
Well, that outraged. I mean, you're breaking faith with us, they said. They didn't stop there. Later, they revised it when the war kept going on, and then the 3 years guys were going to get out. Then the Congress stepped in and said, you're in for the duration. The bottom line is, the Confederacy ever gets you in uniform, you don't get out because they keep changing the rules on you. And that was considered national conscription was considered a fundamental abridgment of individual rights by many people. That's something the government should never force a citizen into uniform. A citizen should volunteer their service. U.S. government waited a year, then it did it in the spring of 1863, although it always respected original terms of enlistment. Never made it the war for the duration the way the Confederacy did.